Across more than 27 centuries of recorded history, the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel would generate more speculation, more expeditions, more scholarly debate, and more extraordinary claims than perhaps any other vanished people in human memory, inspiring theories that placed their descendants on every inhabited continent, in mountain kingdoms and jungle settlements, among nomadic horsemen and isolated island communities, while simultaneously shaping the religious imagination of billions of people who read in their disappearance a divine mystery yet to be fully revealed. The search for these lost tribes would draw Spanish conquistadors into the forests of the Americas, would occupy the minds of English polymaths during the Age of Newton, would motivate dangerous journeys across the Ethiopian highlands and the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush, and would eventually produce one of the most remarkable homecoming movements of the 20th century, as communities from Africa and Asia travelled to the modern state of Israel claiming ancestry from those ancient exiles. The very phrase, lost tribes, would enter the vocabulary of the world's major languages, becoming a metaphor for any scattered or forgotten people, while the actual historical question of what happened to those tens of thousands of deportees in 722 before the Common Era would remain genuinely unresolved, caught somewhere between archaeological evidence, genetic testing, oral tradition, and the enduring human need to believe that nothing precious is ever truly lost. But on the morning when Assyrian siege engines first breached the walls of Samaria, when the soldiers of Sargon II poured through the broken defences of the northern capital after 3 years of desperate resistance, no observer standing amid the smoke and the screaming could have predicted that the defeated inhabitants of this modest hilltop city would become the subject of such endless fascination, that their forced march into exile would echo across 3 millennia of human culture, or that the question of their ultimate fate would be asked and re-asked by prophets, rabbis, missionaries, geneticists, and amateur historians in every century to come. This is the story of the lost tribes of Israel, from their origins in the patriarchal narratives of the Hebrew Bible, through their formation as a settled people in the hill country of Canaan, through the golden age of the united monarchy under David and Solomon, through the bitter division of the kingdom and the centuries of conflict that followed, through the catastrophic Assyrian conquest that scattered them to the winds, and through the remarkable afterlife of their memory, which has generated more theories about their whereabouts than any other displaced population in human history, theories that have placed them among the indigenous peoples of the Americas, in the British Isles, in the mountains of Afghanistan, in the highlands of Ethiopia, in the jungles of India, and in dozens of other locations where communities have claimed, with varying degrees of evidence, to preserve the heritage of those ancient exiles who were marched away from their homeland in the 8th century before the Common Era, and who vanished, so far as the contemporary historical record can determine, into the vast administrative machinery of the Assyrian Empire. The landscape of the ancient Near East in the centuries before the Assyrian deportations presented a complex tapestry of peoples, languages, and political arrangements that would shape the world into which the tribes of Israel first emerged as a distinct cultural entity. The great river valleys of the Nile to the southwest and the Tigris and Euphrates to the northeast had given rise to civilizations whose monuments and records already stretched back more than 2,000 years by the time of the events that concern this account. Between these centres of power lay the narrow land bridge connecting Africa to Asia, a corridor of hills and valleys and coastal plains that various peoples had crossed and settled and fought over since the earliest periods of human migration. The region that would become known as Canaan occupied a particularly strategic position along this corridor, its ports opening onto the Mediterranean trade routes, while its inland highways connected the great powers of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Whoever controlled this territory could tax the caravans that passed through it, could project military force in multiple directions, and could claim a significance far beyond what the modest agricultural productivity of the region might otherwise justify. The peoples who inhabited this land in the centuries before Israelite settlement represented a diverse collection of Semitic-speaking groups whose religious practices, governmental structures, and cultural traditions would influence the Israelites in ways that later biblical writers would both acknowledge and condemn. The Canaanites proper occupied the lowland valleys and coastal cities, building sophisticated urban centres whose remains have been excavated at sites throughout modern Israel, Lebanon and Jordan. The Amorites had established kingdoms in the interior highlands and across the Jordan River into regions that would later be associated with specific Israelite tribes. The Jebusites held the fortified hilltop that would eventually become Jerusalem, a site that showed evidence of continuous occupation stretching back to the 3rd millennium before the Common Era. The Philistines, a sea people whose origins likely trace to the Aegean world, had established a confederation of city-states along the southern coastal plain, bringing with them distinctive pottery styles and military technologies that would pose a persistent challenge to Israelite expansion. The religious landscape of Canaan before the emergence of Israelite monotheism featured an elaborate pantheon of deities whose worship took place at high places, sacred groves and urban temples throughout the region. The supreme god El presided over a divine council that included Baal, the storm god whose cult would prove particularly attractive to later Israelite populations, and Asherah, a mother goddess whose carved images have been found at sites throughout the ancient Near East. The fertility of the land depended, according to Canaanite belief, on the proper veneration of these deities through sacrificial offerings, festival celebrations and ritual practices that later Israelite prophets would denounce as abominations. The tension between these indigenous religious traditions and the exclusive worship of the god later known by the unpronounceable name written with 4 Hebrew letters would define much of the internal religious conflict that characterized Israelite history, a conflict that would ultimately contribute to the theological explanation that later writers would offer for the catastrophe of the Assyrian conquest. The biblical narrative traces the origins of the Israelite people to the figure of Abraham, a wanderer from the Mesopotamian city of Ur who journeyed westward at divine command to settle in the land of Canaan, where his descendants would become as numerous as the stars of heaven. His son Isaac and his grandson Jacob continued this patriarchal line, and it was Jacob whose nocturnal wrestling match with a mysterious divine being produced the name Israel, the name that would designate both an individual and a nation. Jacob fathered 12 sons through his wives Leah and Rachel, and their handmaidens Bilhah and Zilpah, and from these 12 sons descended the 12 tribes whose names would be inscribed on the breastplate of the high priest, and whose territories would be mapped across the Promised Land. The 12 tribal names recited in various orders throughout the biblical text were Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. The complexity of this system increased when Joseph's allocation was divided between his 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, while the tribe of Levi, consecrated for priestly service throughout the land, received no territorial inheritance of its own, but instead was allocated cities scattered among the other tribes. This arrangement produced the distinctive pattern of a theoretical 12 combined with a practical 13 or 14, depending on how the counting was performed, a pattern that would generate considerable discussion among later interpreters seeking to harmonize the various biblical lists and genealogies. The sojourn in Egypt that brought Jacob and his sons into the orbit of the pharaohs, the bondage that followed their initial welcome, the deliverance through the leadership of Moses, the 40 years of wilderness wandering, and the eventual conquest of Canaan under Joshua constitute the foundational narrative of Israelite identity, the story that later generations would rehearse at their festivals and teach to their children as the definitive account of how the people came to inhabit their land. The historical relationship between this narrative and the archaeological record of the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age in the region of Canaan has generated extensive scholarly debate, with some researchers proposing that the Israelites emerged primarily from within Canaanite society rather than through external conquest, while others have found evidence consistent with population movements from Egypt and Transjordan during the relevant period. The resolution of these debates remains contested, but the narrative itself, whatever its precise historical origins, functioned as the charter myth of Israelite civilization, explaining both the divine election of the people and their obligations under the covenant established at Mount Sinai. The settlement period, conventionally dated to the 12th and 11th centuries before the Common Era, saw the 12 tribes establishing themselves in their respective territories, with the highland regions of the central and northern interior becoming particularly associated with Israelite occupation. The tribe of Judah dominated the southern highlands, its territory extending from the wilderness of the Negev northward to the vicinity of Jerusalem, which remained under Jebusite control until David's conquest. Benjamin occupied a narrow band of territory immediately north of Judah, while Ephraim and Manasseh, the 2 tribes descended from Joseph, controlled the rich agricultural lands of the central highlands that would later form the heartland of the northern kingdom. The tribes of the north, including Dan, Naphtali, Asher, Issachar and Zebulun, occupied territories ranging from the Galilee highlands to the Mediterranean coastal approaches, while the Transjordanian tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh held lands east of the Jordan River, whose position on the frontier would render them particularly vulnerable to pressure from neighbouring peoples. The political organisation of this settlement period featured a loose confederation of tribes rather than a centralised monarchy, a system that later biblical writers would characterise as an era when there was no king in Israel, and every man did what was right in his own eyes. The Book of Judges preserves accounts of charismatic military leaders who arose in times of crisis to deliver the people from foreign oppression, figures such as Deborah, Gideon, and Samson, whose exploits combined miraculous intervention with practical military skill. This period of decentralised governance gradually gave way to demands for a king who could provide more consistent leadership and military coordination, particularly as the threat from the Philistine city-states intensified along the coastal plain. The establishment of the monarchy under Saul, the first king of Israel, marked a fundamental transformation in Israelite political organisation, though the biblical text presents this transformation as fraught with ambivalence about the theological implications of human kingship. Saul's reign, conventionally dated to the late 11th century before the Common Era, achieved some success in defending against Philistine aggression, but ultimately ended in disaster at the Battle of Mount Gilboa, where the king and his sons perished fighting against the very enemy that the monarchy had been established to resist. The rise of David, originally a warrior in Saul's service who had subsequently become an outlaw leader in the Judean wilderness, brought a ruler whose military and political genius would establish the territorial framework within which Israelite identity would be defined for centuries to come. David's reign, celebrated in the biblical text as a golden age despite its internal conflicts and personal tragedies, united the 12 tribes under a single crown in a manner that would never be fully replicated after his death. His capture of Jerusalem from the Jebusites provided the dynasty with a neutral capital, located on the boundary between the northern and southern tribes, whose religious significance he enhanced by bringing the Ark of the Covenant to rest within its walls. His military campaigns extended Israelite control from the borders of Egypt to the Euphrates River, creating a territorial empire that encompassed not only the traditional tribal lands, but also the vassal states of Moab, Edom, Ammon, and portions of Aram. The administrative systems he established, the professional army he maintained, and the royal ideology he promoted created a model of Israelite kingship that subsequent rulers would seek to emulate even as they fell short of his achievements. Solomon, David's son and successor, brought the united monarchy to its greatest extent of territorial control and material splendour, while simultaneously sowing the seeds of its eventual division. His building projects, including the temple in Jerusalem whose construction absorbed vast quantities of cedars from Lebanon and gold from Ophir, demonstrated the wealth and organisational capacity of the Israelite state at its peak. His diplomatic marriage alliances with foreign powers, including the daughter of Pharaoh, established Israel as a recognised player in the international system of the ancient Near East. His patronage of wisdom, literature and administrative organisation created institutions that would shape Israelite culture for generations to come. The temple that Solomon constructed on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, the site that David had purchased as a place of sacrifice, became the central sanctuary of Israelite religion, the dwelling place of the divine presence between the wings of the cherubim, the destination of pilgrimage festivals that drew worshippers from throughout the land. The detailed descriptions of the temple's architecture, furnishings and dedication ceremonies preserved in the biblical text reflect the profound significance that later Israelite writers attached to this structure, a significance that would intensify after the temple's destruction and that would shape Jewish and Christian imagination for millennia to come. The 2 bronze pillars named Yachin and Boaz that stood at the temple's entrance, the great bronze basin called the Sea that rested on 12 bronze oxen, the golden lampstands and incense altars, and the innermost chamber containing the ark itself, all contributed to a sacred geography that positioned Jerusalem at the centre of the Israelite universe. The costs of Solomon's ambitious programs, however, placed severe strains on the Israelite population, particularly the northern tribes who provided the bulk of the labour for royal construction projects. The biblical text records that Solomon conscripted 30,000 men for work in Lebanon, cutting and transporting the cedars required for his buildings, while an additional 70,000 burden bearers and 80,000 stonecutters laboured on the construction sites themselves. This corvée system, reminiscent of the bondage that Israelite tradition remembered from Egypt, generated resentment that would prove politically explosive after Solomon's death. The administrative districts that Solomon established did not precisely correspond to the ancient tribal boundaries, a reorganisation that may have reflected rational administrative considerations, but that also severed the connection between traditional tribal identity and governmental structure. The crisis that followed Solomon's death around the year 930, before the Common Era, exposed the fragility of the United Monarchy's foundations. When Solomon's son Rehoboam travelled to Shechem to receive the acclamation of the northern tribes, the assembly confronted him with a demand for relief from the burdens his father had imposed. The council of his elders advised accommodation, but the young king instead followed the advice of his contemporaries and threatened to increase rather than diminish the people's labour, declaring famously that, whereas his father had chastised them with whips, he would chastise them with scorpions. The Northern Assembly's response was immediate and devastating. They raised the cry of secession, declaring that they had no portion in David and no inheritance in the son of Jesse, and they made Jeroboam son of Nebat, a former official who had previously fled to Egypt after a failed revolt, their king. The division of the kingdom created two separate Israelite states, whose relations would oscillate between alliance, rivalry, and outright warfare throughout the 2 centuries that followed. The southern kingdom of Judah, encompassing the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, along with the Levitical priests who served in Jerusalem, remained under the rule of David's descendants, maintaining the temple cult and the royal theology that linked the dynasty to divine promises of eternal rule. The northern kingdom of Israel, comprising the 10 remaining tribes with their greater population and more productive agricultural territories, required the establishment of alternative religious centres to prevent its subjects from travelling to Jerusalem for pilgrimage and thereby renewing their attachment to the Davidic house. Jeroboam's response to this political religious challenge produced what later Judean writers would characterise as the original sin of the northern kingdom. He established royal sanctuaries at Bethel and Dan, at the southern and northern extremities of his realm respectively, and placed in these sanctuaries golden calves that he presented as the gods who had brought Israel out of Egypt. The extent to which this represented genuine apostasy from Yahwistic religion, or merely an alternative iconographic tradition for the worship of the same deity, has been debated by scholars, with some suggesting that the bulls may have served as pedestals for the invisible divine presence in the same manner that the ark served this function in Jerusalem. Later biblical writers, however, uniformly condemned this innovation as idolatry, establishing a framework within which every subsequent northern king would be evaluated according to whether he continued in the sins of Jeroboam. The political instability that characterized the northern kingdom throughout its 2-century existence contrasted sharply with the dynastic continuity of the Davidic house in the south. The northern kingdom experienced 9 different dynasties during this period, with numerous kings meeting violent ends at the hands of usurpers who claimed the throne through assassination and civil war. The house of Omri, which produced the famous Ahab and his Phoenician queen Jezebel, achieved a period of relative stability and international prominence, establishing the new capital at Samaria, whose impressive fortifications have been revealed through archaeological excavation. The house of Jehu, which came to power through a bloody purge of the Omrid dynasty and its Baal-worshipping establishment, ruled for nearly a century, but ultimately succumbed to the same pattern of internal violence that had brought it to power. The religious conflicts within the northern kingdom, particularly the tension between the worship of Yahweh and the worship of Baal, produced the prophetic confrontations that feature so prominently in the biblical narrative. Elijah's contest with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, Elisha's miracles and political interventions, and the oracles of Amos and Hosea against the social injustice and religious syncretism of Israelite society all emerge from this northern context, providing later readers with portraits of prophetic faith in conflict with royal power and popular apostasy. The prophets warned repeatedly that the covenant relationship between Israel and its God was conditional upon obedience to divine law, and that persistent unfaithfulness would bring the curses enumerated in the Mosaic covenant, including defeat, deportation, and the destruction of the land itself. While the northern kingdom struggled with its internal conflicts, the Assyrian Empire was building the military and administrative machinery that would eventually engulf it. The Neo-Assyrian Empire, whose heartland lay in the fertile region between the upper Tigris and its tributaries in what is now northern Iraq, had emerged from a period of weakness in the 11th and 10th centuries to become the dominant power of the ancient Near East. A succession of aggressive and capable rulers, including Ashurnasirpal II, Shalmaneser III, and Tiglath-Pileser III, expanded Assyrian territory through systematic campaigns of conquest that combined military superiority with calculated policies of terror designed to discourage resistance. The Assyrian army represented the most formidable military force the ancient Near East had yet seen, its professional infantry supported by cavalry, chariots, and sophisticated siege equipment capable of reducing the strongest fortifications. The detailed reliefs carved on the walls of Assyrian palaces, now housed in museums including the British Museum and the Louvre, depict with graphic precision the battering rams, siege towers, and assault ramps that enabled Assyrian forces to capture walled cities, as well as the horrific punishments inflicted on captured enemies, including impalement, flaying, and the piling of severed heads beside conquered gates. These images served propagandistic purposes, demonstrating to visiting ambassadors and subject populations the futility of resistance and the consequences of rebellion. The policy of mass deportation that the Assyrians employed against conquered peoples served multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. The removal of local populations from their ancestral lands destroyed the social networks and traditional leadership structures that might otherwise have organized resistance. The settlement of deportees in distant regions of the empire, where they lacked kinship connections and local knowledge, rendered them dependent on imperial administration for their survival. The introduction of foreign populations into conquered territories created communities whose loyalty to the empire was ensured by their isolation amid potentially hostile neighbours. These policies, applied systematically across the empire's expansion, relocated hundreds of thousands of people over the course of the Neo-Assyrian period, creating a remarkably heterogeneous population throughout Mesopotamia and beyond. The northern kingdom of Israel first came into direct contact with Assyrian power during the reign of Shalmaneser III, whose campaign of 853 before the Common Era was checked by a coalition of Syrian and Palestinian states, including Israel under King Ahab at the Battle of Karkar. The Assyrian advance was temporarily halted, but the long-term trajectory was clear. By the mid-8th century, Tiglath-Pileser III was demanding tribute from Israel and intervening directly in the kingdom's internal politics, supporting some claimants to the throne while deposing others. The Assyrian king annexed portions of Israelite territory, including the Transjordanian regions and parts of Galilee, and deported their populations as early as 732 before the Common Era, a foretaste of the more comprehensive deportation that would follow. The final crisis of the northern kingdom began when King Hoshea, having initially submitted to Assyrian suzerainty, attempted to throw off the yoke by withholding tribute and seeking an alliance with Egypt. The Assyrian response was devastating. Shalmaneser V besieged Samaria, and after his death, his successor Sargon-Kuz completed the capture of the city in 722 or 721 before the Common Era. The Assyrian records claim that Sargon deported 27,290 inhabitants of Samaria, though the actual total of deportees from the northern kingdom over the preceding decade was certainly higher. These people were settled, according to the biblical account, in Hala, in Gozan on the river Haber, and in the cities of the Medes, locations that can be identified with reasonable confidence as lying in northern Mesopotamia and the western Iranian plateau. The deportees from the northern kingdom thus became scattered across the eastern reaches of the Assyrian Empire, settled among populations who spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and maintained different cultural traditions. The Assyrian administrative records that have survived from this period document the presence of Israelite names among the populations of various imperial provinces, evidence that the deportees were integrated into the existing administrative framework rather than maintained as a distinct community. Over the succeeding generations, in the absence of the temples, the festivals, and the social structures that had maintained their distinctive identity in their homeland, these deportees gradually assimilated into the surrounding populations, their descendants adopting local languages and customs until the memory of their Israelite origin faded into oblivion. This process of assimilation, entirely consistent with what is known about the fate of other deported populations throughout the Assyrian Empire, would have proceeded inexorably in the normal course of events. Yet the disappearance of the 10 tribes into the vast administrative machinery of the empire was not the end of their story, but merely the beginning of its transformation into legend. the survivors in the southern kingdom of Judah, the prophetic writers who interpreted these events as divine punishment for Israel's unfaithfulness, and the later communities who read these texts as scripture found in the disappearance of the 10 tribes, a mystery that demanded explanation, and a hope that promised eventual restoration. The prophetic literature that emerged from this period spoke not only of judgment, but also of future redemption, a time when the scattered children of Israel would be gathered from the ends of the earth and restored to their land. The prophet Isaiah envisioned a day when the Lord would recover the remnant of his people from Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Cush, from Elam, from Shinar, from Hamath, and from the coastlands of the sea, assembling the outcasts of Israel and gathering the dispersed of Judah from the 4 corners of the earth. The prophet Ezekiel described a vision of dry bones coming together, bone to bone, clothed again with sinew and flesh and skin, breathing again with the breath of life, a symbolic resurrection of the whole house of Israel that had given up hope of restoration. These prophetic visions, whatever their original historical referent, established a framework within which the disappearance of the 10 tribes could be understood not as final annihilation, but as temporary scattering, a prelude to eventual restoration that would exceed in glory even the original settlement of the land. This theological framework would prove extraordinarily generative in the centuries that followed, inspiring searches for the lost tribes that would span the globe and generate theories whose variety and creativity reflected the profound human need to believe that nothing precious is ever truly and irretrievably lost. The theological framework that emerged from the prophetic tradition did not remain confined to the realm of abstract hope. Within the Jewish communities that survived the Babylonian exile and returned to rebuild Jerusalem under Persian patronage, speculation about the fate of the lost tribes became intertwined with emerging apocalyptic and eschatological thought. The period between the return from Babylon and the Roman destruction of the Second Temple witnessed the composition of numerous texts that expanded upon the biblical narrative, filling in gaps and elaborating upon mysteries that the canonical scriptures had left unresolved. Among these mysteries, the fate of the 10 tribes occupied a position of particular fascination, offering writers and visionaries a canvas upon which to project their hopes for cosmic restoration and their interpretations of divine purpose in history. The apocryphal book of 2nd Esdras, also known as 4th Ezra, composed in the aftermath of the Roman destruction of the Jerusalem Temple in 70 of the Common Era, contains one of the most influential accounts of what had supposedly become of the lost tribes. According to this text, the 10 tribes who'd been carried away captive in the days of King Hoshea formed a remarkable resolution during their exile. They determined to leave the multitude of nations among whom they had been settled, and to journey to a distant land where no human race had ever dwelt, in order that they might there observe the laws that they had failed to keep in their own country. The text describes how they entered the Euphrates by the narrow passages of the river, for at that time the Most High performed signs for them and stayed the courses of the river until they had passed over. The journey through that region, called by the text Azareth, required 1.5 years of continuous travel, and there the 10 tribes remained, keeping their statutes, waiting for the time when the Most High would again gather them and bring them back through those same narrow passages. The name Azareth itself appears to derive from a Hebrew phrase meaning another land, suggesting that the author conceived of the destination as a place beyond the known world, a territory set apart from the ordinary geography of human habitation, where the tribes could preserve their identity in isolation until the appointed time of restoration. This account proved remarkably influential in shaping subsequent speculation about the lost tribes. The notion that they had deliberately separated themselves from surrounding populations, travelling to a remote land specifically in order to maintain their religious observances, provided a framework that could accommodate almost any theory about their present location. If the tribes had travelled for 1.5 years beyond the Euphrates, they might have reached almost anywhere in the vast continental expanses of Asia, and if they had settled in a land where no human race had previously dwelt, they might be found in any territory that had been unknown to the ancient Mesopotamian civilizations. The theological significance of the account was equally important, for it suggested that the tribes had not merely been passively assimilated into the populations of the Assyrian Empire, but had actively chosen separation, maintaining their distinctive identity in a kind of extended wilderness sojourn that echoed the 40 years of wandering in the Sinai desert during the Exodus. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era as a client of the Roman imperial household, offered a more prosaic assessment of the tribe's whereabouts that nonetheless contributed to the sense of their continued existence as a significant population. In his Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus declared that the 10 tribes were beyond the Euphrates until now, and that they constituted an immense multitude whose numbers could not be estimated. This brief statement, coming from a historian who claimed descent from the priestly aristocracy of Jerusalem and who had personal knowledge of Jewish communities throughout the Roman world, carried considerable weight among later readers seeking evidence that the tribes had survived as a recognizable population. Josephus did not specify where beyond the Euphrates the tribes resided, nor did he indicate whether they had preserved their distinctive religious practices, but his testimony that they existed as an identifiable group of significant size sustained the hope that they might eventually be located and contacted. The Talmudic literature that developed over the following centuries preserved various traditions about the lost tribes, reflecting the diversity of opinion that existed among the rabbis regarding their fate and their prospects for return. One tradition, preserved in the Mishnah tractate Sanhedrin, attributed to Rabbi Akiva the view that the 10 tribes would not return, citing the verse from Deuteronomy that spoke of the Lord casting them into another land as this day, interpreting the phrase as implying permanence comparable to the permanence of the present day. However, the opposing view, attributed to Rabbi Eliezer, maintained that the tribes would indeed return, interpreting the same verse as indicating that just as a day grows dark and then becomes light again, so too the tribes who are now in darkness would eventually see their darkness illuminated. This Talmudic debate established the parameters within which subsequent Jewish thought would oscillate, some authorities accepting the finality of the tribe's disappearance, while others maintained hope for their eventual restoration. Another Talmudic tradition, preserved in the tractate Yevamot, addressed the halakhic status of potential marriages involving members of the 10 tribes, indicating that the rabbis considered the possibility that individuals descended from the northern kingdom might still exist and might seek to reintegrate themselves into the Jewish community. The Talmud records the opinion that if someone came from among the 10 tribes and betrothed a Jewish woman, the betrothal would be valid but accompanied by doubt, suggesting that the person's status as a full member of the community of Israel could not be definitively confirmed. This halakhic discussion, whatever its practical significance, reflects the persistence of belief that the tribes continue to exist somewhere beyond the boundaries of the known Jewish world, and that contact with them, however unlikely, remained within the realm of possibility. The geographical horizons of the ancient world limited the range of speculation about where the lost tribes might be found. But as those horizons expanded, so too did the theories about tribal locations. The medieval period witnessed a dramatic expansion of geographical knowledge through the travels of merchants, missionaries, and pilgrims who ventured far beyond the boundaries of Christendom and the Islamic world, returning with accounts of peoples and customs that stimulated the imagination of their contemporaries. Within this context of expanding geographical awareness, claims about the lost tribes proliferated, each reflecting the particular preoccupations and knowledge of its author. The figure of Eldad Hadani, who appeared in Jewish communities of North Africa and Spain in the 9th century, represents one of the most intriguing of these medieval claimants to knowledge of the lost tribes. Eldad presented himself as a member of the tribe of Dan, who had travelled from his distant homeland to establish contact with the Jewish communities of the Mediterranean world. According to his account, the tribe of Dan, together with the tribes of Naphtali, Gad and Asher, inhabited a region in East Africa beyond the rivers of Cush, a territory that Eldad identified with the biblical land of Havilah. These tribes, he claimed, had never experienced foreign domination since their departure from the land of Israel, maintaining an independent Jewish kingdom ruled by their own king and governed by their own laws. Eldad described the customs and halakhic practices of these tribes in considerable detail, including distinctive interpretations of Jewish law that diverged in various particulars from the rabbinic traditions known to his Mediterranean audiences. The reception of Eldad's claims among the Jewish scholars of his time illustrates the complexity of medieval responses to reports about the lost tribes. Some authorities, including the Gaon Tzemach ben Hayim of Sura, express skepticism about various aspects of Eldad's account, questioning whether his reported customs could be reconciled with normative Jewish practice. Others, however, accepted his testimony as authentic, incorporating elements of his account into their own understanding of Jewish history and geography. The halakhic traditions that Eldad attributed to the tribes of his homeland were discussed and analysed by subsequent generations of scholars, some of whom attempted to harmonize them with mainstream rabbinic interpretation, while others used them as evidence for the existence of alternative Jewish legal traditions. Regardless of whether Eldad was a genuine traveller from a remote Jewish community, an imaginative storyteller drawing upon existing legends, or something in between, his appearance in the 9th century stimulated interest in the lost tribes and established precedents for future claims about their continued existence. The legend of Prester John, which circulated widely in Christian Europe from the 12th century onward, represented a parallel phenomenon in the Christian imagination, though one that intersected in complex ways with Jewish traditions about the lost tribes. According to the legend, Prester John was a powerful Christian king who ruled a vast empire somewhere beyond the boundaries of the Islamic world, variously located in India, Central Asia, or Ethiopia. His kingdom was described as a land of wonders, filled with marvels both natural and supernatural, and he was said to command armies that could potentially ally with the Crusaders against the Muslim powers that controlled the Holy Land. In some versions of the legend, Prester John's subjects included the lost tribes of Israel, who lived under his benevolent protection and awaited the time of their restoration. The connection between Prester John and the lost tribes reflected the eschatological anxieties of medieval Christendom, which expected the end times to be preceded by the appearance of various peoples and powers mentioned in biblical prophecy. The Jewish tribes, whose restoration was foretold by the prophets, naturally fit within this framework, and their association with a powerful Christian monarch beyond the reach of Islam suggested that they might play a role in the cosmic drama that medieval Christians anticipated. The legend of Prester John also drew upon earlier traditions about the 10 tribes being confined behind the mountains of the Caucasus or restrained by the gates of Alexander, barriers that would be breached in the last days when the tribes would emerge to participate in the final battles of history. These traditions, which conflated the 10 tribes with the apocalyptic peoples of Gog and Magog, mentioned in the Book of Ezekiel and the Book of Revelation, imbued the search for the lost tribes with an urgency that went beyond mere historical curiosity. The travels of Benjamin of Tudela in the 12th century provided what appeared to be more sober and systematic information about Jewish communities across the known world, though his account included reports that extended beyond his personal observations into the realm of hearsay and legend. Benjamin departed from his home in northern Spain around 1160 and journeyed eastward through France, Italy, Greece, and the Byzantine Empire, continuing through the Crusader states of the Levant into the territories of the Islamic caliphates, reaching as far as Persia and possibly beyond. Throughout his travels, Benjamin recorded the Jewish communities he encountered, noting their size, their prominent leaders, their occupations, and their relationships with the surrounding populations. His account, which circulated widely in Hebrew manuscripts and was eventually printed and translated into numerous languages, became one of the most important sources for knowledge about medieval Jewish geography and demography. Within his larger narrative, Benjamin included reports about remote Jewish communities that he had not personally visited, but about which he had received information from informants during his travels. He wrote of Jewish communities in the mountains of Persia who maintained their independence from external rule, of Arabian tribes who lived as nomadic warriors in the desert, and of communities in Central Asia whose origins were traced to the ancient exiles from the northern kingdom. Benjamin reported that in the land of Persia he had heard of Jews dwelling in the mountains of Nisabur, who possessed their own fortresses and engaged in warfare with the surrounding peoples, claiming descent from the tribes of Dan, Zebulun, Asher, and Naphtali. He also recorded traditions about the Jews of Khaybar in the Arabian Peninsula, who were said to maintain a warlike independence and to claim connection with the lost tribes. These reports, whatever their factual basis, contributed to the medieval Jewish understanding of a dispersed Israel whose scattered communities might be found in the most remote corners of the world. The expansion of European geographical knowledge following the voyages of Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and their successors in the late 15th and 16th centuries opened entirely new possibilities for theories about the lost tribes. The discovery of continents unknown to the classical and medieval world, populated by peoples whose origins demanded explanation, stimulated speculation that reached far beyond anything that earlier generations had contemplated. The encounter with the indigenous peoples of the Americas in particular generated theories that would persist for centuries and influence religious movements whose effects continue to the present day. The first sustained arguments for an Israelite origin of the American Indians emerged from Spanish writers grappling with the theological and legal implications of the conquest of the New World. The question of who the native peoples were and where they had come from had significant consequences for how they should be treated under Spanish law and Christian theology. If they were descendants of known biblical populations, their conversion to Christianity could be understood within established frameworks of salvation history. The Dominican friar Diego Duran, writing in the 16th century, was among the first to argue systematically that the indigenous peoples of Mexico were descended from the 10 lost tribes, pointing to what he perceived as similarities between Aztec religious practices and Jewish customs as described in the Hebrew scriptures. Duran noted parallels in sacrificial rituals, dietary restrictions, and ceremonial observances that he believed could only be explained by common descent from the ancient Israelites. The theory received perhaps its most influential elaboration in the 17th century through the work of the Amsterdam rabbi Manasseh ben Israel, whose engagement with the question of the lost tribes was prompted by a dramatic report from the New World. In 1644, a Portuguese Jewish converso named Antonio de Montesinos arrived in Amsterdam with an extraordinary account of his experiences in South America. According to Montesinos, while travelling in the remote interior of what is now Colombia, he had encountered a tribe of Indians who recited Hebrew prayers, and who told him that they were descendants of the tribe of Reuben, who had journeyed to the Americas in ancient times following their exile from the land of Israel. Montesinos testified to this account before the leaders of the Amsterdam Jewish community, and his testimony made a profound impression on Manasseh ben Israel, who saw in it confirmation of prophetic visions about the scattering of Israel to the ends of the earth. Manasseh ben Israel published his response to Montesinos' account in his work The Hope of Israel, which appeared in 1650 and was quickly translated into English and Latin, achieving wide circulation among both Jewish and Christian readers. In this work, Manasseh argued that the discovery of Israelites in the Americas fulfilled the prophetic vision of Israel scattered to every corner of the world, including the most remote regions previously unknown to the peoples of the Old World. He connected this discovery to his messianic expectations, arguing that the gathering of Israel from all nations, including from the Americas, would be a prelude to the final redemption. Manasseh's work had practical as well as theological implications, for he used it to support his diplomatic efforts to secure the readmission of Jews to England, from which they had been expelled in 1290. If the restoration of Israel required that Jews be present in every nation of the earth, then their readmission to England became not merely a matter of religious tolerance, but a contribution to the cosmic process of redemption. The identification of American Indians with the lost tribes found resonance among English Puritans who shared Manasseh's apocalyptic expectations, and the theory continued to influence speculation about indigenous origins throughout the colonial period and beyond. The similarities that early observers perceived between native customs and Jewish practices, often exaggerated or misinterpreted through the lens of European preconceptions, provided what seemed to be empirical support for the theory. The presence of circumcision-like practices among some tribes, the observance of purification rituals, the construction of sanctuaries and altars, and the existence of flood narratives and creation myths that seemed to echo biblical accounts, all contributed to the impression that the indigenous peoples preserved traditions inherited from Israelite ancestors. The most enduring institutionalization of the lost tribes theory in relation to the Americas came through the religious movement founded by Joseph Smith in early 19th century America. Smith claimed to have received divine revelations that included an account of ancient Israelite migrations to the Americas, narratives that would be published as the Book of Mormon in 1830. According to this text, a family of Israelites departed Jerusalem around 600 before the Common Era, before the Babylonian destruction of the city, and travelled to the Western Hemisphere, where they established civilizations whose history the book purports to record. The peoples described in the Book of Mormon were identified with the ancestors of the indigenous American populations, and the book's narrative arc traced their spiritual and political development over approximately 1,000 years of American history. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which grew from Smith's revelations to become a significant world religion with millions of adherents, thus institutionalized a version of the lost tribes theory that continues to shape the beliefs of a substantial portion of the American population. The geographical expansion of lost tribes theories was by no means confined to the Americas. The British Isles themselves became the subject of elaborate theories connecting the Anglo-Saxon and Celtic populations to the ancient tribes of Israel. The movement known as British Israelism, which emerged in the 17th century and reached its greatest influence in the 19th and early 20th centuries, proposed that the peoples of Britain were the literal descendants of the 10 lost tribes who had migrated westward following their Assyrian exile. According to proponents of this theory, the tribes had travelled through the Caucasus Mountains, across the steppes of Russia and Eastern Europe, through the territories of ancient Scythia, and eventually to the islands of the northwest Atlantic, where they established the kingdoms that would become Britain and Ireland. British Israelism drew upon a combination of etymological arguments, historical speculation, and prophetic interpretation to support its claims. Advocates pointed to supposed linguistic connections between Hebrew and Celtic or Germanic languages, identifying Hebrew roots in English words and place names. They traced the migration routes of ancient peoples through classical and medieval sources, connecting the Scythians, the Cimmerians, and other nomadic populations mentioned by Greek and Roman historians to the exiled Israelites. They interpreted biblical prophecies about the future greatness of the descendants of Joseph as referring to the British Empire, seeing in the global reach of British power the fulfillment of divine promises made to the patriarchs. The theory provided a framework for understanding British imperial success as the working out of providential destiny, and it appealed to audiences who sought religious validation for national and racial identity. The influence of British Israelism extended beyond the British Isles to the settler colonies of the British Empire, including the United States, Canada, Australia, and South Africa. Various religious movements and organisations promoted the theory through publications, lectures, and educational programmes, reaching audiences across the English-speaking world. While British Israelism never achieved acceptance among mainstream biblical scholars or historians, who found its etymological and historical arguments unconvincing, it persisted as a significant current in popular religious thought, influencing later movements, including some forms of Christian identity ideology. The theory illustrates how the search for the lost tribes could serve as a vehicle for the expression of national, ethnic, and racial identity, transforming ancient biblical narratives into frameworks for understanding contemporary social and political realities. The expansion of European contact with Africa produced another significant chapter in the history of lost tribes speculation, one that would ultimately lead to the dramatic recognition and relocation of an entire community in the 20th century. Reports of Jewish or Judaizing communities in Africa had circulated in European and Middle Eastern sources for centuries, often intertwined with legends of Prester John and fantasies of wealthy Christian kingdoms hidden beyond the lands of Islam. The Scottish explorer James Bruce, who travelled through Ethiopia in the late 18th century, brought back accounts of a people known as the Falasha, a designation derived from a Jagez word meaning strangers or exiles, who lived in the highlands of the Simeon Mountains and practiced a form of religion that appeared to be Judaism. Bruce's descriptions introduced European audiences to a community that would fascinate scholars, missionaries, and religious leaders for the following 2 centuries. The Beta Israel, as they called themselves, maintained practices that distinguished them sharply from their Christian and Muslim neighbours. They observed the seventh-day Sabbath with strict prohibitions on work, lighting fires, and cooking. They practiced circumcision on the 8th day after birth, as prescribed in the Book of Genesis. They followed dietary laws that closely resembled the kashrut of Rabbinic Judaism, avoiding the consumption of certain animals and requiring the separation of blood from meat. They built structures called mesgids for prayer and study, maintaining these sacred spaces with practices of ritual purity that echoed the laws surrounding the ancient temple in Jerusalem. They observed annual festivals that corresponded to the biblical holidays, including a celebration resembling Passover that commemorated the exodus from Egypt and a day of fasting and atonement that paralleled Yom Kippur. Yet the Judaism of the Beta Israel also differed in significant ways from the rabbinic tradition that had developed among the Jews of Europe and the Middle East following the destruction of the Second Temple. The Beta Israel possessed the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, along with other biblical texts, but they had no knowledge of the Talmud, the vast compendium of rabbinic commentary and legal discussion that had become central to Jewish religious life elsewhere. They observed holidays and customs that other Jewish communities did not recognize, including the Sigd, an annual pilgrimage festival during which the community gathered on mountain tops to renew their covenant with God. Their religious leadership was structured differently, with monks and nuns playing roles that had no parallel in rabbinic Judaism. The language of their scriptures was Ge'ez, the ancient liturgical language of Ethiopia, rather than Hebrew, and while they preserved some Hebrew prayers and blessings, their overall religious expression had developed in isolation from the main currents of post-biblical Jewish development. The question of how to understand the Beta Israel and their origins became a subject of intense scholarly and religious debate. Some theories propose that they were indeed descended from one of the lost tribes, most commonly the tribe of Dan, and that their ancestors had migrated to Ethiopia in ancient times, perhaps during the period of the Assyrian exile or even earlier. Other theories suggested that they were descended from Jews who had come to Ethiopia during the time of Solomon, perhaps as part of the legendary relationship between the Israelite king and the Queen of Sheba, or during later periods of trade and contact between the Mediterranean world and the Horn of Africa. Still other scholars propose that the Beta Israel were not ethnically Israelite at all, but rather Ethiopian Christians who had adopted Jewish practices at some point in their history, perhaps through contact with Jewish traders or missionaries, or as a result of religious reform movements within Ethiopian Christianity itself. Modern genetic studies have provided some evidence bearing on these questions, though the results have been complex and subject to varying interpretations. Some studies have identified genetic markers among the Beta Israel that are consistent with Middle Eastern ancestry, suggesting the possibility of ancient migrations or contact between the regions. Other studies have emphasized the genetic continuity between the Beta Israel and other Ethiopian populations, suggesting that any Middle Eastern genetic contribution was relatively small, and that the community was primarily of local origin. The genetic evidence alone cannot resolve the historical questions definitively, and scholars continue to debate the precise origins and development of this remarkable community. What is beyond dispute is the profound religious commitment that the Beta Israel maintained over centuries of isolation and, at times, persecution. They preserved their traditions through periods of conflict with the Ethiopian Christian kingdom, through forced conversions and the destruction of their communities, through famines and political upheavals that threatened their very existence. Their priests and scholars memorized and transmitted their sacred texts across generations, maintaining the knowledge of their religious practices even when written materials were scarce or unavailable. Their identity as Israelites, as members of a community set apart by divine covenant, remained central to their self-understanding despite the absence of contact with other Jewish communities for much of their history. The recognition of the Beta Israel by the wider Jewish world came gradually and not without controversy. In the 19th century, European Jewish organizations began to take interest in the Ethiopian community, sending exploratory missions and eventually establishing educational and welfare programs. The Alliance Israelite Universelle, a French Jewish organization dedicated to assisting Jewish communities worldwide, established a presence in Ethiopia and advocated for the rights and recognition of the Beta Israel. Individual rabbis and scholars debated whether the Beta Israel should be considered fully Jewish according to halakhic standards, and if so, what procedures might be necessary to integrate them into the broader community. The question of formal recognition was resolved definitively in 1973, when the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, Ovadiah Yosef, issued a ruling declaring that the Beta Israel were descended from the tribe of Dan and were therefore Jews in all respects. This ruling, followed by similar determinations from other rabbinical authorities, opened the door for the Beta Israel to immigrate to Israel under the law of return, which grants automatic citizenship to Jews from anywhere in the world. The practical implementation of this recognition, however, would be complicated by political circumstances in Ethiopia and by logistical challenges of truly enormous scale. During the 1980s and 1990s, as Ethiopia was convulsed by civil war, famine and political upheaval, Israeli and international agencies organized a series of dramatic operations to evacuate members of the Beta Israel community. Operation Moses, conducted in 1984 and 1985, secretly transported approximately 8,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel through Sudan, a transit route made necessary by the hostile relations between Israel and the Ethiopian Derg regime. Operation Joshua followed shortly after, bringing additional members of the community who had been stranded in Sudan when Operation Moses was prematurely exposed and halted. The most dramatic of all was Operation Solomon, conducted in May 1991 during the final collapse of the Derg government. Over approximately 36 hours, Israeli military and civilian aircraft conducted a continuous airlift that brought more than 14,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel, a logistical achievement that required the temporary removal of airplane seats to maximise capacity, and that set records for the number of passengers transported on a single aircraft. The arrival of the Ethiopian Jews in Israel represented both the fulfilment of ancient hopes and the beginning of new challenges. The community brought with them traditions and practices developed over centuries of separate development, and their integration into Israeli society raised questions about religious, cultural and social accommodation that continue to be negotiated. Some members of the community underwent symbolic conversion rituals to satisfy certain religious authorities, a requirement that caused controversy and was resisted by many who felt it called into question the authenticity of their Judaism. The community has faced challenges of economic integration, educational achievement and social acceptance, while also contributing to Israeli society in numerous fields, and maintaining the distinctive customs that mark their heritage. The story of the Beta Israel illustrates one possible outcome of the Lost Tribes question, a case in which a community claiming ancient Israelite descent was ultimately recognised and welcomed into the broader Jewish world. Their journey from the highlands of Ethiopia to the modern state of Israel spans not only thousands of miles but thousands of years of separate development and eventual reunion. Whether one understands their origins as literal descent from the tribe of Dan, or as a more complex process of religious and cultural development, their story demonstrates the enduring power of the Lost Tribes narrative to shape identities and inspire communities across vast distances of time and space. The Indian subcontinent has provided another significant chapter in the ongoing search for the Lost Tribes, with multiple communities claiming connections to ancient Israel, and, in some cases, receiving formal recognition that has enabled their migration to the Jewish state. The most prominent of these communities is the Bnei Menashe, a group numbering in the tens of thousands who live primarily in the northeastern Indian states of Mizoram and Manipur, along the borders with Myanmar and Bangladesh. The Bnei Menashe claim descent from the tribe of Manasseh, one of the two half-tribes descended from Joseph, and maintain that their ancestors migrated eastward from the land of Israel following the Assyrian conquest, eventually settling in the remote hill country where their descendants live today. The oral traditions of the Bnei Menashe speak of an ancient journey that carried their ancestors across vast distances over many generations. According to these traditions, the tribe was exiled to Assyria following the fall of Samaria, then continued to migrate eastward through Persia, Afghanistan, Tibet, and China before finally arriving in the region where they now reside. Along this long journey, they maintained certain practices and traditions that they identified as Israelite in origin, including observances that resembled the biblical holidays, songs that contained Hebrew words or names, and customs that set them apart from their neighbours. These traditions were preserved orally across the centuries, passed down from generation to generation, even as the community was isolated from other Jewish populations and underwent significant cultural changes through contact with surrounding peoples. The modern history of the Bnei Menashe as a self-consciously Jewish community began in the mid-20th century, when certain members of the community began to rediscover and emphasize their claimed Israelite heritage. This process was influenced by contact with Christian missionaries who introduced the community to the Bible and stimulated interest in the Hebrew Scriptures, and by a growing awareness of the existence of the State of Israel and the ingathering of Jewish communities from around the world. Some members of the community began to adopt Jewish religious practices more explicitly, observing the Sabbath, following dietary laws, and celebrating the Jewish holidays according to the patterns established in rabbinic tradition. The formal recognition of the Bnei Menashe by Israeli religious authorities came in 2005, when the Sephardic chief Rabbi Shlomo Amar determined that they were descendants of the Lost Tribes and were eligible to convert to Judaism through formal halakhic procedures. This ruling required that members of the community undergo a formal conversion process, including study, circumcision for males who had not been properly circumcised according to Jewish law, and immersion in a ritual bath. Unlike the Beta Israel, whose Judaism was recognized as authentic despite its differences from rabbinic practice, the Bnei Menashe were required to undertake a full conversion, a distinction that reflected differing assessments of the historical and religious status of the two communities. Since that recognition, several thousand members of the Bnei Menashe community have completed the conversion process and immigrated to Israel, where they have established communities and begun the process of integration into Israeli society. The immigration has been facilitated by Israeli governmental and non-governmental organisations dedicated to bringing members of claimed lost tribes communities to Israel, though the process has been complicated by political and bureaucratic challenges on both the Israeli and Indian sides. Thousands more members of the community remain in India, awaiting their opportunity to complete the conversion process and make their own journey to the land that their traditions describe as the homeland of their distant ancestors. The Bnei Menashe are not the only Indian community to claim connection to the ancient tribes of Israel. The Bene Israel, a community that has lived along the western coast of India, primarily in the region around Mumbai for many centuries, maintained their own distinctive Jewish traditions that developed in isolation from other Jewish communities. Unlike the Bnei Menashe, the Bene Israel were recognized as Jews by the broader Jewish world at an earlier period, though debates about their exact status and the procedures required for their integration into other Jewish communities persisted into the 20th century. The origins of the Ben Israel remain uncertain, with theories ranging from descent from Israelite traders or refugees who arrived in India in ancient times, to more recent migrations from Middle Eastern Jewish communities during the medieval period. Further south, the Jews of Cochin, who lived in the port cities of the Kerala coast, maintained their own distinct traditions and claimed origins dating back to the time of King Solomon, when legend held that Israelite merchants had travelled to India as part of the extensive trade networks that brought luxury goods to the ancient Mediterranean world. The Cochin Jews were themselves divided into multiple subgroups, including the Paradisi or foreign Jews who arrived more recently from European and Middle Eastern communities, and the Malabari or native Jews whose presence in India was considered more ancient. Most members of the Cochin Jewish community have since immigrated to Israel, leaving behind the elaborate synagogues and communal structures that testify to their centuries of presence on the Indian coast. The existence of multiple Jewish communities in India, each with its own traditions, languages, and claims to ancient origin, illustrates the complexity of Jewish dispersion and the difficulty of establishing definitive connections to the biblical tribes. Some of these communities may indeed preserve authentic traditions of ancient Israelite migration, while others may represent more recent arrivals or conversions that occurred at various points in history. The diversity of their practices and the variations in their oral traditions suggest that the history of Jewish presence in India cannot be reduced to a single narrative of lost tribes migration, but rather reflects the multiple and complex processes through which communities adopted, preserved, and transformed Jewish identity across time and space. The rugged mountains of Afghanistan and Pakistan have provided another setting for lost tribe speculation, focused on the Pashtun people, one of the largest ethnic groups in the region. The Pashtuns, who number in the tens of millions and live primarily in Afghanistan and the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province of Pakistan, have a martial tradition that has made them famous throughout history as warriors who have resisted every empire that has sought to conquer their homeland. They speak Pashto, an Indo-Iranian language, and follow a code of customary law known as Pashtunwali that emphasizes hospitality, revenge, and personal honor. Yet alongside these cultural characteristics, certain Pashtun traditions and tribal names have suggested to some observers a possible connection to the ancient tribes of Israel. The theory of Pashtun descent from the lost tribes rests on several types of evidence, each of which has been debated by scholars. The most frequently cited evidence involves the names of certain Pashtun tribes, which appear to preserve echoes of Israelite tribal names. The Yusufzai tribe, one of the largest Pashtun groups, bears a name meaning the children of Yusuf, or Joseph, which could suggest descent from one of the two Josephite tribes, Ephraim or Manasseh. The Afridi tribe has been connected by some writers to Ephraim through various etymological arguments, while other tribal names have been proposed as corrupted forms of names like Reuben, Gad, and Asher. Whether these linguistic connections are genuine or represent coincidental similarities, or folk etymologies, remains a matter of dispute. Beyond the tribal names, certain Pashtun customs have been cited as evidence of Israelite origin. The practice of lighting candles on Friday evenings, resembling the Jewish Sabbath custom, has been reported among some Pashtun communities. Dietary restrictions that prohibit the consumption of certain animals echo, at least superficially, the kashrut laws of the Hebrew Bible. The practice of levirate marriage, in which a man marries his deceased brother's widow, was prescribed in the Book of Deuteronomy and is also found among some Pashtun groups. Circumcision on the 8th day after birth, the wearing of fringed garments, and various mourning customs have all been cited as possible traces of Israelite heritage preserved among the Pashtuns despite their formal adherence to Islam. The Pashtuns themselves have various traditions regarding their origins, some of which include claims of Israelite descent. According to certain Pashtun genealogies, the ancestor of the Pashtun people was Qais Abdur Rashid, a companion of the Prophet Muhammad who traced his own ancestry back to a figure named Afghana, supposedly a grandson of King Saul. This tradition links the Pashtuns to the royal house of ancient Israel and provides a genealogical framework for understanding their claimed Israelite heritage within an Islamic context. Other Pashtun traditions offer different accounts of origin, and the diversity of these traditions suggests that no single narrative has commanded universal acceptance within the community. Modern genetic studies have attempted to shed light on the question of Pashtun ancestry, though the results have been complex and do not provide clear support for the lost tribes theory. Some studies have identified genetic markers among certain Pashtun groups that are consistent with Middle Eastern ancestry, while others have emphasized the genetic diversity of the Pashtun population and its continuity with other populations of the region. The genetic evidence suggests that the Pashtuns, like most populations, have complex and mixed ancestry that cannot be reduced to descent from a single ancient source. The scholarly consensus generally regards the lost tribes theory of Pashtun origins as unproven and probably incorrect, viewing the cultural similarities as the result of parallel development, cultural diffusion, or coincidence rather than direct descent. The theory nonetheless continues to circulate in popular and religious literature, and it has attracted interest from some members of both the Pashtun and Jewish communities who find meaning in the possibility of ancient connection. The search for the lost tribes has also extended to the far reaches of East Asia, where theories have been proposed connecting the ancient Israelites to peoples as distant as the Chinese and the Japanese. The Jewish community of Kaifeng, in the central Chinese province of Henan, represents one documented case of Jewish presence in China, though its origins and history are distinct from lost tribe speculation. The Kaifeng Jews appear to have arrived in China during the medieval period, probably along the overland trade routes that connected China to the Middle East, and they maintained a distinctive community for many centuries before gradually assimilating into the broader Chinese population. Their synagogue, built and rebuilt multiple times over the centuries, was last standing in the mid-19th century before falling into ruin, and the community itself declined as members intermarried with non-Jewish Chinese and ceased to maintain their distinctive practices. The Kaifeng Jews were not claiming descent from the lost tribes, and scholars generally understand their community as the result of historical migration during the period of recorded history, rather than ancient biblical dispersal. Nevertheless, their existence has sometimes been incorporated into broader lost tribes frameworks, and some observers have speculated about whether earlier waves of Israelite migration might have brought the ancestors of the 10 tribes to China in the period following the Assyrian exile. These speculations generally lack historical evidence and are not taken seriously by mainstream scholars, but they illustrate the geographical scope of lost tribes, theorizing, and its capacity to reach into virtually every corner of the inhabited world. Japan has provided another setting for lost tribes speculation, with theories proposed by both Japanese and foreign writers suggesting connections between Japanese religious practices and ancient Israelite traditions. These theories point to similarities between certain Shinto rituals and practices described in the Hebrew Bible, including purification rites, the structure of sacred spaces, and various festival observances. The carrying of the portable Shinto shrines known as mikoshi has been compared to the carrying of the Ark of the Covenant, while the layout of certain Japanese temples has been analysed for parallels to the structure of the biblical tabernacle. Linguistic arguments have proposed connections between Hebrew and Japanese words, and some theorists have identified supposed Hebrew inscriptions or symbols in Japanese historical sites. These theories have generally been rejected by scholars of both Japanese history and biblical studies, who find the proposed similarities unconvincing or explicable through other means. The deep antiquity and independent development of Japanese religious traditions make direct influence from ancient Israel highly unlikely, and the linguistic and symbolic arguments advanced by proponents of these theories rarely withstand critical examination. Nevertheless, the theories continue to attract popular interest and have been promoted through books, films, and websites that present them to audiences curious about possible hidden connections between distant cultures. The persistence of lost tribes, speculation into the modern era, despite the skepticism of mainstream scholarship, reveals something important about the psychological and spiritual appeal of these theories. The idea that ancient Israelites might have travelled to the most remote corners of the earth, preserving their identity across thousands of years and countless generations, speaks to deep human longings for connection, continuity, and meaning. It offers the possibility that the scattered fragments of a people might one day be reunited, that what was lost might be found, that the promises of ancient prophets might yet be fulfilled in ways that transcend ordinary historical expectation. For communities claiming descent from the lost tribes, these identities provide a sense of distinctive purpose and historical significance that sets them apart from their neighbours and connects them to a narrative of cosmic importance. To believe that one's ancestors were members of the chosen people, bearers of divine revelation, and participants in a covenant that stretches back to the patriarchs, is to understand one's own existence as part of a story far larger than any individual life or local history. This sense of participation in sacred history has motivated communities to preserve distinctive practices across centuries of isolation, to resist pressures toward assimilation, and ultimately, in some cases, to undertake dramatic journeys of return to the land of their claimed ancestors. The ongoing immigration of communities like the Beta Israel and the Bnei Menashe to Israel demonstrates that the lost tribes narrative continues to generate real-world consequences in the contemporary period. The modern state of Israel, founded on the principle of providing a homeland for the Jewish people, has grappled with questions about who exactly counts as Jewish and which communities can claim the right of return. The recognition of far-flung communities as legitimate heirs of the ancient Israelite tradition has expanded the boundaries of Jewish identity in ways that earlier generations could hardly have imagined, bringing together peoples whose separate development over thousands of years produced dramatically different cultural expressions of a shared spiritual inheritance. The process by which these communities have been evaluated, recognised, and ultimately integrated into Israeli society represents one of the most remarkable chapters in modern Jewish history. A story that illuminates both the extraordinary reach of the Lost Tribes narrative and the practical complexities that arise when ancient legends encounter contemporary institutions. The Beta Israel of Ethiopia provide perhaps the most fully documented example of this process. For centuries, the Ethiopian Jews maintained their traditions in the highlands of their African homeland, celebrating festivals that the rest of the Jewish world had long forgotten, following dietary laws derived directly from the biblical text rather than from later rabbinic interpretation, and preserving a religious life that seemed to represent an earlier stratum of Jewish practice frozen in time. Their sacred texts were written not in Hebrew but in Ge'ez, the classical language of Ethiopia, and their religious leaders were not rabbis in the conventional sense, but priests called Kesoch, who claimed descent from the ancient priestly line. The Beta Israel knew nothing of the Talmud, that vast compendium of law and lore that had shaped rabbinic Judaism over the centuries following the destruction of the Second Temple. They did not celebrate Hanukkah, the festival commemorating the Maccabean rededication of the Temple, because their traditions had crystallized before that event occurred. In many ways, encountering the Beta Israel was like stepping back in time, meeting a form of Judaism that had developed along an entirely separate trajectory from the Judaism of the rabbis, the Judaism of Europe and the Middle East, the Judaism that most modern Jews would recognize as their own. The question of the Beta Israel's origins has never been definitively settled. Some scholars have proposed that they descend from Jews who emigrated from the land of Israel in ancient times, perhaps during the period of the First Temple, perhaps even earlier. Others have suggested that they are the descendants of converts, local Ethiopians who adopted Judaism at some point in antiquity, possibly through contact with Jewish communities in southern Arabia or Egypt. Still others have proposed more complex scenarios involving multiple waves of migration and conversion over many centuries. The traditional accounts of the Beta Israel themselves offer various origin stories, some claiming descent from the tribe of Dan, others tracing their ancestry to the retinue that accompanied the Queen of Sheba when she returned from her famous visit to King Solomon. According to Ethiopian tradition, the Queen of Sheba bore Solomon a son named Menelik, who became the first emperor of Ethiopia and who brought the Ark of the Covenant itself back to his mother's homeland, where it remains hidden to this day in a chapel in the city of Axum. Whether any of these traditions reflect actual historical events remains unknown, but they have shaped the self-understanding of the Beta Israel for generations and have given them a sense of deep connection to the ancient Israelite past. The modern history of the Beta Israel has been marked by dramatic upheavals and transformations. During the political turbulence that gripped Ethiopia in the late 20th century, including the overthrow of Emperor Haile Selassie in 1974 and the subsequent civil wars and famines, the situation of the Beta Israel became increasingly precarious. Many undertook dangerous overland journeys to Sudan, hoping to reach Israel from there, and thousands died along the way from disease, starvation, and violence. The Israeli government, which had been debating the status of the Beta Israel for decades, ultimately authorized a series of dramatic rescue operations. Operation Moses in 1984 and 1985 brought approximately 8,000 Ethiopian Jews to Israel through Sudan, while Operation Solomon in 1991, conducted over a single remarkable weekend as the Ethiopian government was collapsing, airlifted more than 14,000 Beta Israel to safety in just 36 hours. These operations captured the imagination of the world and demonstrated the lengths to which the Jewish state was willing to go to gather in communities that it recognized as part of the scattered house of Israel. The integration of the Beta Israel into Israeli society has not been without challenges. Cultural differences, experiences of discrimination, and the difficulties of adjusting from a traditional agrarian society to a modern industrialized nation have created ongoing struggles for many Ethiopian Israelis. The religious practices that the Beta Israel had maintained for centuries, practices that represented their authentic and continuous tradition, were not always recognized as valid by the Israeli religious establishment, and many Ethiopian Jews were required to undergo conversion rituals that seemed to delegitimize the Judaism they had preserved through so many generations. These tensions continue to generate debate and controversy within Israeli society, raising fundamental questions about the nature of Jewish identity and the relationship between different streams of Jewish practice. The Bnei Manej of northeastern India represent a more recent and in some ways more controversial case. Unlike the Beta Israel, whose Jewish practices had been documented by European travellers and missionaries for several centuries, the Bnei Menashe emerged into broader awareness only in the latter half of the 20th century. Their claim to Israelite descent rests primarily on oral traditions passed down within their communities, traditions that speak of an ancient migration from the land of Israel through Persia, Afghanistan, Tibet, and finally into the hills of what is now northeastern India. These traditions describe how the ancestors of the Bnei Menashe gradually lost many of their original religious practices during the long centuries of wandering, adopting local customs and beliefs while preserving certain distinctive elements that hinted at their Israelite origins. In the 1950s and 1960s, a spiritual awakening occurred among some members of these communities, led by figures who claimed to have experienced revelations and visions calling them to return to the faith of their ancestors. This movement grew over the following decades, and communities in Mizoram and Manipur began actively practicing Judaism, studying Hebrew, observing the Sabbath and the festivals, and identifying themselves as the lost tribe of Manasseh. The Israeli government and rabbinical authorities were initially skeptical, but investigations conducted in the 1990s and 2000s led to a gradual acceptance of the Bnei Menashe claim, at least in modified form. While the chief rabbinate has not definitively ruled that the Bnei Menashe are descendants of the ancient tribe of Manasseh, it has recognized them as descendants of Israelite tribes in general, and has authorized their formal conversion to Judaism, following which they become eligible for immigration to Israel under the law of return. Several thousand Bnei Menashe have now made this journey, leaving their homes in the remote hills of India to begin new lives in the Jewish state. Their arrival has added another layer to the remarkable diversity of Israeli society, where one can now encounter Jews whose ancestors came from Poland and Morocco, from Yemen and Iraq, from Ethiopia and India, from virtually every corner of the globe where the Jewish diaspora established itself over the long centuries of dispersion. The presence of communities like the Bnei Menashe and the Beta Israel serves as a living reminder that the history of the Jewish people cannot be reduced to any single cultural or geographic matrix, that the scattering foretold by the prophets took countless forms and reached into places that the prophets themselves could never have imagined. The claims of other communities to lost tribes' descent have not fared as well in the eyes of the Israeli establishment. The Lemba of southern Africa, despite genetic evidence suggesting possible Middle Eastern ancestry, and despite their preservation of practices that seem to echo Jewish customs, have not been recognised as Jews by the Israeli rabbinate and would need to undergo formal conversion in order to immigrate to Israel under the law of return. The same is true of communities in other parts of Africa, in South America, in various Asian countries, whose traditions include elements that suggest possible Israelite influence or origin. The question of who counts as a descendant of the lost tribes and what evidence is sufficient to substantiate such claims remains deeply contested and involves complex intersections of religious authority, historical scholarship, genetic science, and political considerations. The scientific dimension of lost tribes research has expanded significantly in recent decades, with the development of sophisticated techniques for analysing genetic data. Studies of mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down through the maternal line, and of Y chromosome markers, which are transmitted from fathers to sons, have made it possible to trace patterns of ancestry and migration that would otherwise remain invisible. Some of these studies have produced intriguing results. Research on the Lemba, for instance, has identified a high frequency of the so-called Cohen modal haplotype among certain Lemba clans, a genetic signature that is also found at elevated rates among Jewish populations and that has been associated with the priestly lineage supposedly descended from Aaron, the brother of Moses. This finding has been cited by some as evidence supporting the Lemba's claim to Israelite ancestry, though other scientists have urged caution, noting that the presence of particular genetic markers does not necessarily indicate direct descent from ancient Israel and could have other explanations involving historical contact and intermarriage. Genetic studies of other populations claiming lost tribes connections have generally produced more ambiguous results. The Pashtuns of Afghanistan, despite their traditional claims to Israelite descent, show genetic profiles that are largely consistent with the other populations of Central and South Asia, without distinctive markers that would indicate a significant Middle Eastern component. Similar conclusions have been reached regarding most other communities that have been proposed as descendants of the lost tribes. The genetic evidence, while it can sometimes provide tantalizing hints, rarely offers definitive proof of ancient migrations that may have occurred nearly 3 millennia ago, and even when it does identify possible Middle Eastern ancestry, it cannot specify whether that ancestry derives from the ancient Israelites, from Arab traders, from Phoenician sailors, or from any number of other historical possibilities. The limitations of genetic evidence have not prevented it from playing an increasingly prominent role in debates about Jewish identity and lost tribes claims. In a world where DNA testing has become accessible and affordable, individuals and communities seeking to establish connections to Jewish ancestry can now submit samples for analysis and receive reports that purport to reveal their deep genealogical past. These reports have become a new form of evidence in discussions about who might qualify as a descendant of the ancient tribes, adding a scientific veneer to questions that were once addressed purely through historical and religious methods. The tension between genetic evidence and traditional religious criteria for determining Jewish status remains unresolved, with different authorities placing different weight on biological ancestry, as opposed to religious practice, community acceptance, and formal conversion. Beyond the specific communities that have claimed or been assigned lost tribes descent, the broader influence of the lost tribes narrative can be traced through many areas of modern religious and political thought. The idea that scattered Israel would one day be gathered from the ends of the earth has played a significant role in Christian Zionism, the movement of Christian support for the establishment and maintenance of a Jewish state in the land of Israel. Many Christian Zionists view the return of Jewish communities from around the world, including communities that claim descent from the lost tribes, as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy, a sign that the events foretold by the Hebrew prophets are now coming to pass in historical time. This prophetic interpretation has motivated significant financial and political support for Israel from certain Christian communities, particularly in the United States, and has shaped debates about Middle Eastern policy and the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The lost tribes narrative has also found expression in various forms of new religious movements and alternative spiritualities. The teachings of the Latter-day Saints, which present an elaborate account of ancient Israelites journeying to the Americas and founding civilizations that are described in the Book of Mormon, represent the most successful institutionalization of lost tribes themes in a new religious context. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has grown from its 19th century American origins into a global religion with millions of adherents, and the Book of Mormon's narrative of Israelite migration remains central to its theology and practice. Other religious movements have incorporated lost tribes themes in different ways, sometimes identifying particular ethnic groups as descendants of the tribes, sometimes proposing mystical or allegorical interpretations of the scattering and gathering of Israel, sometimes combining lost tribes ideas with other esoteric or apocalyptic traditions. The persistence of lost tribe speculation into the 21st century reflects broader patterns in how human beings construct and maintain collective identities across time. The question of who belongs to a particular people, and what criteria determine that belonging, has no single answer that applies in all contexts. Biological descent, cultural practice, religious affiliation, linguistic heritage, and simple self-identification all play roles in determining how individuals and communities understand their place within larger historical narratives. The Lost Tribes tradition offers a framework within which communities that might otherwise seem marginal or disconnected can claim participation in one of the most consequential narratives of human history, the story of a people chosen to receive divine revelation and scattered across the earth to await eventual restoration. The psychological and spiritual dimensions of Lost Tribes belief deserve consideration alongside its historical and political dimensions. For individuals who come to believe that they or their community descend from the ancient tribes of Israel, this discovery can be profoundly transformative. It offers a sense of special purpose and destiny, a connection to a sacred past that elevates everyday existence into participation in cosmic drama. It provides an explanation for feelings of difference or distinctiveness that may have accompanied the individual throughout their life, suggesting that these feelings reflect an authentic heritage that has persisted despite centuries of concealment. The appeal of such beliefs is not difficult to understand, particularly in contexts where individuals may feel disconnected from meaningful tradition or uncertain about their place in the larger sweep of human events. The communities that maintain Lost Tribes identities often develop rich ceremonial and narrative traditions that express and reinforce their sense of distinctive heritage. Songs, dances, oral histories, and ritual practices are transmitted across generations, creating patterns of memory and meaning that bind community members together and distinguish them from their neighbours. These traditions may incorporate elements derived from contact with mainstream Judaism, elements preserved from whatever earlier practices the community maintained, and elements that have developed locally in response to particular historical circumstances. The result is often a form of religious life that is recognisably connected to broader Jewish tradition, while also exhibiting distinctive features that reflect the community's unique history and location. The Israeli government's engagement with Lost Tribes claims represents an ongoing negotiation between religious authority, historical scholarship, and political pragmatism. The decision to recognise certain communities as eligible for immigration while excluding others reflects judgments about the relative strength of different claims, the practical implications of large-scale immigration from particular regions, and the complex politics of religious identity in a state that defines itself as simultaneously Jewish and democratic. These decisions have been controversial both within Israel and in the broader Jewish world, with some arguing that recognition has been too restrictive, and others expressing concern about diluting Jewish identity through acceptance of communities whose connection to historical Judaism is tenuous. The debates continue, and each new claim from some previously unknown community forces renewed consideration of the fundamental questions at stake. The Lost Tribes of Israel, whether understood as historical populations that can be traced through evidence and argument, or as symbolic carriers of hope and longing, remain embedded in the consciousness of communities around the world. Their story is woven into sacred texts that continue to be read and interpreted, into liturgical prayers that invoke the ingathering of the exiles, into political movements that see in modern events the unfolding of ancient prophecy. The 10 tribes that marched into Assyrian captivity nearly 3,000 years ago may have disappeared from the historical record, but they have never disappeared from the human imagination. They persist as figures of possibility, reminders that the past is never entirely closed, that what was scattered may yet be gathered, that history itself remains open to transformations that would seem impossible by ordinary reckoning. As the modern state of Israel approaches its second century and the global Jewish population continues to evolve through immigration, intermarriage, conversion, and cultural change, the questions raised by the Lost Tribes narrative become ever more pertinent. Who is a Jew? What constitutes authentic connection to the ancient Israelite tradition? How should communities that have developed in isolation be evaluated when they seek recognition and return? These questions have no final answers, only ongoing negotiations that will continue to shape the meaning and boundaries of Jewish identity for generations to come. The physical landscapes where the Lost Tribes drama has unfolded deserve attention in their own right, for they have shaped the possibilities of movement, concealment, and survival in ways that abstract discussions of identity and belonging cannot fully capture. The Assyrian deportations did not scatter the northern tribes into a featureless void, but rather into specific territories with distinctive geographical characteristics that would have profoundly affected the fates of the displaced populations. The regions mentioned in the biblical account, Hala, the river Haber, Gossan, and the cities of the Medes, correspond to areas in what is now northern Iraq, northeastern Syria, and northwestern Iran. These were not empty wastelands awaiting settlement, but rather established centres of civilization, with their own populations, their own languages, their own religious traditions into which the Israelite exiles would have been absorbed. The river Haber flows through territory that has been continuously inhabited for thousands of years, its valleys providing agricultural land that could support substantial populations. The cities of the Medes lay in the mountain country of western Iran, a landscape of valleys and plateaus that would later give rise to one of the great empires of antiquity under Cyrus and his successors. Whatever happened to the deported Israelites in these regions, they did not vanish into wilderness, but rather entered into ongoing human communities, where processes of assimilation and transformation would have begun immediately. The question of what assimilation actually meant in the ancient Near East requires careful consideration, for the modern conception of ethnic identity as something fixed and clearly bounded does not map easily onto the social realities of 3,000 years ago. People in the ancient world certainly maintained distinctions between groups, recognised different languages and customs and religious practices, but the boundaries between groups were often more permeable than later observers have sometimes assumed. Intermarriage, religious conversion, linguistic shift, and cultural borrowing were normal features of life in the cosmopolitan empires of Assyria, Babylon, and Persia. A population that maintained distinctive practices for several generations might gradually abandon them over subsequent centuries, as younger generations found it more practical or desirable to adopt the ways of the surrounding majority. Alternatively, a community might preserve certain core traditions while adapting others, producing over time a hybrid culture that retained echoes of multiple origins. The Assyrian policy of population transfer was designed precisely to break the connections between peoples and their ancestral lands, to shatter the political and religious structures that might otherwise have supported resistance, and to create populations whose loyalties would be directed toward the empire rather than toward local traditions. The policy was effective not because it physically eliminated the transferred populations, but because it created conditions under which the normal processes of cultural change would tend to erode distinctive group identities over time. The territories of the former northern kingdom of Israel underwent their own transformations following the Assyrian conquest. The biblical account describes how the Assyrians brought peoples from various other conquered regions and settled them in the cities of Samaria, replacing the deported Israelites with foreign populations. These new settlers brought their own religious practices, their own customs, their own languages, though over time they would also adopt elements of the local traditions they encountered. The famous Samaritans of later Jewish and Christian texts were descended in part from these foreign settlers, and in part from the Israelites who had not been deported, creating a population that claimed connection to the ancient Israelite heritage, while being regarded with suspicion or hostility by the Jews of Judah and Jerusalem. The Samaritans developed their own version of the Torah, maintained their own temple on Mount Gerizim, and preserved traditions that in some respects may be older than the forms that became standard in Rabbinic Judaism. A small community of Samaritans survives to the present day, numbering only a few hundred individuals but maintaining unbroken continuity, with a tradition that stretches back to the aftermath of the Assyrian deportations. In some sense, the Samaritans represent one answer to the question of what happened to the northern tribes, though they have never been embraced as lost tribes by those who seek such populations in distant lands. The survival of the southern kingdom of Judah for more than a century after the fall of the north created conditions under which refugees from the north could find shelter and integration. The biblical text preserves hints of this process, describing northerners who joined themselves to Judah during periods of religious reform or political crisis. The reign of Hezekiah, who ruled Judah during the final years of the northern kingdom, appears to have been a period when significant numbers of northerners may have migrated south, bringing their traditions and their family histories into the surviving kingdom. The discovery of hundreds of seal impressions bearing Judean royal stamps in the territory of the former northern kingdom suggests that Hezekiah may have attempted to extend his authority over the remnant population in the north following the Assyrian withdrawal. If substantial numbers of northerners did indeed integrate into Judean society during this period, then the sharp distinction between the lost 10 tribes and the surviving 2 tribes becomes considerably more complicated. The ancestors of later Jewish populations may have included individuals from all 12 tribes. Their diverse origins gradually merged into a common identity as the centuries passed and the memories of earlier distinctions faded. The Babylonian exile, which struck the southern kingdom in the 6th century before the Common Era, created a parallel experience of deportation that in some ways mirrored the earlier Assyrian deportations, but ultimately led to a very different outcome. The Judeans who were carried to Babylon maintained their distinctive identity with remarkable tenacity, developing the institutions and practices that would evolve into Rabbinic Judaism over the subsequent centuries. The prophet Ezekiel, himself one of the Babylonian exiles, delivered oracles that addressed both the exiles in Babylon and the remnant in Judah, maintaining the vision of a unified people despite geographical separation. The later return from Babylon under Persian sponsorship established a pattern of diaspora and return that would become central to Jewish self-understanding, a model for how a scattered people could maintain identity across centuries and eventually reconstitute themselves in their ancestral land. This pattern shaped expectations about the northern tribes as well, generating hope that they too would eventually return from their more distant exile to rejoin their southern brethren in the restored land of Israel. The geographical imagination that developed around the lost tribes during the medieval and early modern periods reflected the expanding horizons of European knowledge about the wider world. Before the age of exploration, European maps contained vast blank spaces or regions filled with legendary creatures and peoples. The lost tribes could be located in these unmapped territories precisely because so little was known about them. As European explorers, missionaries and merchants penetrated into previously unknown regions, they encountered peoples whose existence had not been suspected, and whose customs and appearances differed dramatically from European norms. The impulse to identify these newly discovered peoples with the lost tribes reflected both the biblical framework through which Europeans understood human diversity and the desire to fit unexpected discoveries into familiar categories. If all humanity descended from Noah's 3 sons, as the biblical genealogy taught, then every human population must fit somewhere in that family tree, and the lost tribes provided a convenient category for peoples who did not obviously belong elsewhere. The theory that identified Native Americans with the lost tribes gained particular traction because it addressed a genuine puzzle that European thinkers found troubling. The existence of human populations in the Americas seemed difficult to reconcile with biblical narratives that described human origins in the Near East and dispersal from there following the flood. How had people reached the American continents? When had they arrived? Were they truly descended from Adam and Noah? Or did their existence suggest multiple creations that would challenge the unity of the human species? Identifying the Native Americans as Israelites resolved these difficulties by placing them within the biblical framework, tracing their ancestry through Abraham, Isaac and Jacob back to the universal human family that originated in the Garden of Eden. The theory also carried implications for how Europeans should relate to indigenous peoples. If Native Americans were descendants of Israel, then they were in some sense a chosen people who had fallen away from their covenant but might be restored through Christian evangelization, fulfilling prophecies about the ingathering of the scattered tribes. The remarkable diversity of Native American cultures, languages, and physical appearances presented obvious difficulties for any unified theory of Israelite origin. But proponents of the theory proved adept at explaining away these obstacles. The tribes had been separated from their original homeland for more than 2,000 years, it was argued, and during that time they had forgotten much of their ancestral language and religion while developing new customs adapted to their American environment. The apparent differences among Native American groups could be explained as the result of different tribes settling in different regions and developing in isolation from one another. Similarities in vocabulary, ritual practice, or physical feature between particular Native American groups and ancient Israelites were seized upon as evidence for the theory, while differences were attributed to the processes of change that any population would undergo over 2 millennia of separation from its origins. The Book of Mormon, published in 1830 by Joseph Smith, presented the most elaborate version of the American Israelite theory, describing multiple waves of migration from the ancient Near East to the Americas in pre-Christian times. According to this narrative, a family led by the prophet Lehi departed from Jerusalem around 600 before the Common Era, shortly before the Babylonian destruction, and eventually reached the Americas where their descendants multiplied into great civilizations. The narrative described conflicts between righteous and wicked branches of this Israelite population, culminating in the destruction of the righteous Nephite civilization by the wicked Lamanites, whose descendants, according to early Mormon teaching, included the Native American peoples encountered by European colonizers. The Book of Mormon thus provided a sacred history for the American continent parallel to the sacred history of the Bible, explaining the origin of indigenous populations while also offering them a place in the cosmic drama of salvation. This narrative became foundational for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and continues to shape how millions of believers understand the history of the Americas and the identity of its original inhabitants. British Israelism, which emerged as a distinctive movement in the 19th century, took the lost tribes theory in a direction that served very different ideological purposes. Rather than seeking the tribes among distant or marginalised populations, British Israelism claimed that the Anglo-Saxon and Celtic peoples of the British Isles were themselves the descendants of the lost tribes, making the British Empire not merely a political entity, but a fulfilment of biblical prophecy. The theory traced an elaborate migration route from the Assyrian exile through the Caucasus region, across the steppes of southern Russia, through Central and Western Europe, and finally to the British Isles, where the tribes established the kingdoms that would eventually unite under the English crown. Names were analysed to reveal Israelite origins hidden beneath linguistic changes over centuries. The name Saxon, it was claimed, derived from Isaac's sons. The name British derived from the Hebrew words for covenant and man. The very institutions of British government, from the coronation stone in Westminster Abbey to the maritime power that controlled the seas, were interpreted as fulfilments of promises made to the patriarchs thousands of years earlier. British Israelism achieved considerable popularity during the Victorian and Edwardian eras, attracting adherents across class lines and inspiring numerous publications, lectures and organisations devoted to spreading its message. The theory appealed to British nationalism by suggesting that British power was not merely the result of historical accident or imperial ambition, but rather the working out of divine providence. It provided a sense of special destiny that elevated British identity above other nations, while also connecting it to the most ancient and sacred of traditions. Critics pointed out the numerous historical, linguistic and genealogical problems with the theory, but its appeal did not depend on scholarly rigour. It offered a compelling narrative that gave meaning and significance to British identity, at a moment when the empire stood at the height of its power and confidence. The 20th century brought dramatic changes to the context in which lost tribes' beliefs operated. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 transformed the question of Israelite identity from a matter of purely religious or academic interest into a question with immediate political and legal implications. Israel's law of return, which grants citizenship rights to Jews seeking to immigrate, raised the question of who should count as Jewish for purposes of the law. Claims by various communities to descend from the lost tribes now carried potential consequences for their members' rights to Israeli citizenship and the benefits that came with it. The Israeli rabbinical authorities found themselves forced to adjudicate claims that earlier generations of scholars had been able to treat as merely curious or speculative. The recognition of the Beta Israel of Ethiopia as Jews eligible for immigration represented a landmark decision with implications that extended far beyond the Ethiopian community itself. The chief rabbinate's determination that the Beta Israel were descended from the tribe of Dan and were authentic Jews who had maintained their identity through centuries of isolation in Africa opened the door to similar claims from other communities. If the Beta Israel could be recognized despite their unfamiliarity with rabbinic tradition and their distinctive religious practices, then other communities with their own claims to ancient Israelite heritage might hope for similar recognition. The dramatic airlifts that brought tens of thousands of Ethiopian Jews to Israel in the 1980s and 1990s demonstrated that lost tribes, narratives could have concrete, life-changing consequences for the individuals and communities involved. The Bnei Menashe of northeastern India followed a different path to recognition, one that illustrates the complexity of evaluating lost tribes' claims in the modern context. Their claim to descend from the tribe of Manasseh rested primarily on oral traditions and cultural practices, rather than on any documented historical connection to the ancient Israelites. The community had converted to Christianity under British colonial influence and only began to identify openly as Jewish in the 20th century, adopting Jewish practices and seeking connection with the broader Jewish world. Israeli rabbinical authorities initially viewed their claim with skepticism, but over time the community's sincerity and their willingness to undergo formal conversion to normative Judaism won them acceptance. Thousands of Bnei Menashe have now immigrated to Israel, where they have established communities and become part of Israeli society. Their journey from a remote hill tribe claiming ancient Israelite ancestry to recognize members of the Jewish people illustrates how lost tribes' claims can evolve from legendary assertions into lived realities that shape individual lives and community identities. The genetic testing that has become possible through advances in modern science has added new dimensions to the evaluation of lost tribes' claims, though the results have often been more ambiguous than either proponents or skeptics might have hoped. Studies of the Lemba people of southern Africa did find genetic markers consistent with ancient Middle Eastern ancestry, including markers associated with the priestly Cohen lineage that tradition traces back to Aaron, the brother of Moses. These findings lent some scientific support to Lemba oral traditions about their origins, though they could not definitively establish what route the ancestors of the Lemba had travelled or precisely when they had arrived in Africa. Similarly, genetic studies of various other populations claiming Israelite ancestry have produced mixed results, sometimes finding evidence consistent with Middle Eastern origins and sometimes finding no such evidence. The interpretation of genetic data is complicated by the long time periods involved, the multiple migrations and intermixtures that all human populations have experienced, and the difficulty of distinguishing genetic signatures that might reflect Israelite ancestry from those that reflect other Middle Eastern populations with similar genetic profiles. The continuing emergence of new communities claiming lost tribes identity demonstrates that the narrative retains its power to shape how people understand their own origins and their place in the world. In recent decades, groups in various parts of Africa, Asia, and the Americas have come forward with claims to Israelite descent, each presenting its own combination of oral traditions, cultural practices, and historical arguments. Some of these claims have attracted serious scholarly attention, while others have been dismissed as lacking credible foundation. The internet has facilitated the spread of lost tribes beliefs and enabled previously isolated communities to connect with one another and with the broader Jewish world. Documentary films, websites, and social media have made the stories of communities like the Bnei Menashe and the Lemba known to global audiences, inspiring other groups to investigate their own possible connections to ancient Israel. The psychological and spiritual dimensions of lost tribes identification continue to operate alongside the historical and political dimensions. For individuals who discover or embrace an Israelite identity, the experience can be one of profound homecoming, of finally understanding who they truly are and where they truly belong. The sense of connection to an ancient and sacred tradition, the feeling of participating in a cosmic narrative that stretches across millennia, the possibility of return to an ancestral homeland all exercise powerful attraction. Communities that maintain lost tribes, identities often develop strong bonds among their members, united by their shared understanding of their distinctive heritage and their common aspirations for recognition and return. The rituals and practices that such communities develop serve to reinforce group identity and transmit it to younger generations, creating continuity across time even as the specific content of tradition evolves in response to changing circumstances. The relationship between lost tribes communities and mainstream Judaism remains complex and sometimes fraught. Mainstream Jewish communities have sometimes viewed lost tribes claimants with suspicion, questioning the authenticity of their claims and worrying about the implications of accepting as Jews populations whose connection to historical Judaism may be tenuous. The requirement that some lost tribes communities undergo formal conversion before being accepted as fully Jewish reflect this caution, even as they raise questions about whether conversion can be meaningful for a community that already believes itself to be Jewish by descent. At the same time, some Jewish thinkers have embraced the lost tribes communities as fulfillments of prophetic hopes, seeing in their emergence signs that the long-awaited ingathering of the exiles is finally beginning. The tensions between these different perspectives continue to shape how lost tribes' claims are evaluated and how the boundaries of Jewish identity are negotiated in the contemporary world. The question of what it means to belong to Israel, to be counted among the children of Jacob, has thus become one of the defining challenges of contemporary Jewish thought, a challenge that the ancient prophets could scarcely have anticipated when they spoke of gathering the scattered remnants from the ends of the earth. The categories that once seemed clear, the distinction between Israelite and Gentile, between those within the covenant and those outside it, have become permeable in ways that both trouble and inspire those who grapple with them. When a community in rural India or northeastern Africa, or the highlands of Papua New Guinea, claims descent from the ancient tribes, the question of how to respond demands engagement with the deepest questions of identity, authenticity, and the nature of religious belonging itself. The philosophical implications of the lost tribes phenomenon extend beyond the boundaries of Jewish communal concern into broader questions about human nature and the construction of collective memory. The persistence of these claims across such vast stretches of time and space suggests something fundamental about how human beings relate to their past, how they understand their origins, and how they situate themselves within narratives larger than their individual lives. Every culture, it seems, possesses origin myths that connect the present community to some distant and often sacred beginning. The Lost Tribes narrative functions as one of the most powerful and adaptable of such myths, capable of being appropriated by peoples of vastly different circumstances and deployed in the service of vastly different ends. The appeal of the Lost Tribes identification lies partly in its combination of specificity and openness. The framework provides a definite point of origin, the 12 tribes of ancient Israel, and a definite narrative structure. The exile, the scattering, the preservation of identity across generations, and the eventual return. Yet within this framework there remains enormous room for interpretation and adaptation. A community can claim descent from any of the 10 lost tribes, can trace its migration route through any number of intervening lands, can identify almost any cultural practice as evidence of preserved Israelite tradition. This flexibility has allowed the Lost Tribes narrative to be adopted by communities as different as Ethiopian highlanders and English aristocrats, Pashtun warriors and Japanese scholars, each finding in the ancient story a mirror that reflects their own particular circumstances and aspirations. The emotional resonance of the Lost Tribes narrative derives also from its themes of loss and redemption, of exile and return, themes that speak to universal human experiences even as they arise from a particular historical context. Every human being knows what it means to feel displaced, to long for a home that exists perhaps only in memory or imagination, to hope that what has been lost might somehow be recovered. The story of the 10 tribes driven from their ancestral land and scattered across the earth articulates these feelings with mythic power, transforming individual experiences of displacement into participation in a cosmic drama that stretches across millennia. When a community claims Lost Tribes identity, it is claiming not merely biological descent, but participation in this larger narrative, this story of exile and endurance and ultimate restoration. The theological dimensions of the Lost Tribes phenomenon continue to generate reflection and debate among religious thinkers of various traditions. Within Judaism, the prophetic promises of ingathering remain potent sources of hope, their interpretation shaped by contemporary developments, even as they draw on texts composed more than 2,000 years ago. The return of the Ethiopian Beta Israel, the immigration of the Bnei Menashe, the emergence of other communities claiming Israelite descent, can all be read as partial fulfillments of ancient prophecies, signs that the long night of exile may be drawing toward its dawn. At the same time, more sceptical interpreters caution against too readily identifying modern developments with prophetic visions, noting that the prophets may have been speaking in symbolic terms about spiritual realities rather than making literal predictions about demographic movements. Within Christianity, the lost tribes have figured prominently in eschatological speculation, particularly in traditions that emphasize a future restoration of Israel as a precondition for the return of Christ. The idea that the 10 tribes must be discovered and returned to their homeland before the end times can arrive has motivated Christian explorers and missionaries across the centuries, leading them to search for lost Israelites in the most unlikely places. The British Israelite movement represented one particularly elaborate expression of this impulse, while contemporary Christian Zionism often incorporates elements of lost tribe speculation into its broader theological framework. The persistence of these ideas demonstrates how deeply the lost tribes narrative has penetrated the religious imagination of the Christian West, shaping expectations about the future and motivating engagement with the present. The relationship between lost tribes' beliefs and political movements deserves particular attention, for the narrative has repeatedly been deployed in the service of various political agendas. British Israelism, as already noted, provided a religious justification for British imperial expansion, suggesting that the British Empire represented the fulfilment of divine promises made to the ancient Israelites. The identification of various peoples as lost tribes has sometimes been used to justify colonial interventions, with European powers claiming a special obligation to bring the lost tribes back into contact with their religious heritage. Conversely, lost tribes' identities have sometimes been adopted by colonized peoples as a form of resistance, as a way of claiming a sacred heritage that rivals or surpasses that of their colonizers. The appropriation of Israelite identity by communities in Africa, Asia, and the Americas has often carried implicit or explicit political meanings, asserting the dignity and significance of peoples who have been marginalized or oppressed. The scientific study of these questions continues to evolve as new methods and new data become available. Advances in genetic analysis have made it possible to trace human migrations with unprecedented precision, revealing the deep history of population movements and intermixtures that have shaped the genetic landscape of the contemporary world. These studies have confirmed what historians have long suspected, that human populations have always been more mobile and more interconnected than simplistic models of ethnic purity would suggest. The genetic evidence bearing on lost tribes' claims has sometimes supported and sometimes challenged the oral traditions of communities claiming Israelite descent, but in general it has revealed a more complex picture than either proponents or skeptics had anticipated. The genetic heritage of any individual or community reflects contributions from numerous ancestral populations, accumulated across generations through processes of migration, conquest, trade, and intermarriage. Isolating a specifically Israelite component within this complex mixture poses formidable methodological challenges, and the results obtained must always be interpreted with appropriate caution. The cultural transmission of identity across generations operates according to different principles than genetic inheritance, and the relationship between the two forms of continuity is not straightforward. A community may preserve traditions, practices, and beliefs that originated among ancestors who contributed only a small fraction of the community's current genetic heritage. Conversely, a community may have substantial genetic inheritance from a particular ancestral population, while having lost all cultural memory of that connection. The lost tribes phenomenon illustrates both possibilities, with some communities maintaining strong traditions of Israelite descent despite limited genetic evidence, while other populations with significant Middle Eastern genetic markers possess no traditions connecting them to ancient Israel. The question of what constitutes authentic continuity with the ancient tribes thus cannot be answered by genetic evidence alone, but requires consideration of multiple dimensions of identity and heritage. The anthropological study of lost tribes communities has revealed the dynamic and creative processes by which these identities are constructed and maintained. Far from being passive bearers of traditions handed down unchanged from ancient times, these communities actively shape their identities in response to contemporary circumstances, selecting certain elements for emphasis, reinterpreting others in light of new information or new contacts, and inventing practices and narratives that meet present needs while claiming continuity with the past. This observation does not necessarily undermine the authenticity of lost tribes' claims. For all cultural traditions, including those with the most impeccable historical pedigrees, are subject to similar processes of creative adaptation. The Judaism practiced in Jerusalem today differs in countless ways from the religion practiced by the ancient Israelites, having been transformed by centuries of development, interpretation, and response to changing circumstances. The question is not whether a tradition has changed over time, for change is the condition of all living traditions, but whether the changes that have occurred fall within acceptable limits, and whether meaningful continuity has been preserved across the generations. The future of the Lost Tribes phenomenon remains uncertain, though certain trends seem likely to continue. The processes of globalization that have brought previously isolated communities into contact with the broader Jewish world seem unlikely to reverse, meaning that new claimants to Lost Tribes identity will probably continue to emerge and to seek recognition. The development of genetic technologies will provide new tools for investigating these claims, though the interpretation of genetic data will remain contested and complex. The religious and political dimensions of the phenomenon will continue to shape how claims are evaluated and how communities are received, with different actors bringing different assumptions and different agendas to the discussion. The State of Israel, as the political embodiment of Jewish national aspirations, will continue to play a central role in determining which communities are recognized as having legitimate claims to Israelite descent and which are not. The decisions made by Israeli religious and civil authorities have profound practical consequences for the communities involved, determining whether individuals can claim citizenship under the law of return, whether their marriages and conversions will be recognized, and whether they will be welcomed as returning members of the Jewish people or treated as outsiders seeking entry on doubtful grounds. These decisions are inevitably influenced by considerations beyond the purely historical or religious, including demographic concerns, political pressures, and the resources available to absorb new immigrant populations. The communities themselves will continue to navigate the complex terrain of identity in the modern world, balancing their distinctive traditions against the pressures of assimilation, negotiating their relationships with both their immediate neighbours and the distant Jewish communities with which they claim kinship. Some will succeed in maintaining their distinct identities across generations, while others will gradually dissolve into the larger populations among which they live. The individuals within these communities will face choices about how strongly to identify with their claimed Israelite heritage, how much effort to invest in maintaining distinctive practices, and whether to remain in their current locations or to emigrate to Israel or elsewhere. These choices will be shaped by economic opportunities, political circumstances, family considerations, and the countless other factors that influence human decisions about where and how to live. The scholars who study these phenomena will continue their work, refining their methods, gathering new data, and debating the proper interpretation of their findings. The field of lost tribe studies, if such a field can be said to exist, will remain interdisciplinary, drawing on history, anthropology, genetics, religious studies, and other disciplines, each bringing its own perspectives and methods to bear on the questions at hand. The academic debates will sometimes seem remote from the lived experiences of the communities themselves, yet the conclusions reached by scholars have real consequences for how these communities are perceived and treated by the wider world. And beneath all the scholarly debates, the political negotiations, and the individual decisions, the ancient story will continue to exert its power. The narrative of the 12 tribes, of their unity under David and Solomon, of their division and exile and scattering, of the promises of eventual restoration, this narrative has proven remarkably resilient across the centuries, adapting to new circumstances while retaining its essential shape. The story speaks to deep human longings, the desire for belonging, the hope for return, the faith that what has been lost will someday be found. These longings are not unique to any particular culture or tradition, but seem to be woven into the fabric of human consciousness itself. The search for the lost tribes may never reach a definitive conclusion, for the questions involved may not admit of final answers. The 10 tribes of ancient Israel were real historical communities whose members lived, worked, worshipped, raised children, and died in the hill country of Canaan more than 2,000 years ago. When the Assyrian armies came, some were killed, some were deported, some remained, some fled. Their descendants mixed with other populations, married into other families, adopted other customs, forgot old languages, and learned new ones. Over the generations, the thread of continuous identity that connected them to their ancestors grew thinner, until in most cases it became invisible altogether. Whether anything of the ancient tribes survives in the genetic heritage or cultural practices of any contemporary population is a question that may never be answered with certainty, for the evidence that would provide such certainty has been dispersed and diluted beyond recovery. Yet the story of the lost tribes is more than a question of historical fact. It is a story about hope, about the refusal to accept that anything is ever truly and finally lost. It is a story about identity, about the deep human need to know where we come from and who we are. It is a story about faith, about the conviction that the promises of the prophets will be fulfilled, that the scattered will be gathered, that the broken will be made whole. These dimensions of the story cannot be verified or refuted by genetic testing or archaeological excavation, for they belong to a different order of truth than the truth that science investigates. The lost tribes of Israel may or may not survive in any identifiable form in the contemporary world. The communities that claim descent from them may or may not have genuine historical connections to the ancient Israelites. These questions will continue to be investigated, debated, and perhaps never conclusively resolved. But the legend itself, the story of the 10 tribes driven into exile and scattered across the face of the earth, waiting in distant lands for the day of their redemption, this legend has proven more durable than any particular claim about where the tribes went or who their descendants might be. The legend has become part of the common heritage of humanity, inspiring searches and speculations that span continents and centuries, drawing people from vastly different backgrounds into engagement with questions about origins, identity, and ultimate destiny. The children of Jacob, who wrestled with an angel by the waters of the Jabbok and received the name Israel, have indeed spread across the 4 corners of the earth, though not perhaps in the ways the ancient storytellers imagined. Jewish communities exist today on every inhabited continent, preserving traditions that connect them to the ancient land and the ancient covenant, even as they adapt to the circumstances of their various diaspora homes. Whether the communities who claim lost tribes' identity will be integrated into this global Jewish family, or whether they will continue as separate entities with their own distinctive traditions and aspirations, remains to be seen. The story continues to unfold, carried forward by the choices and commitments of countless individuals, shaped by forces historical, political, economic, and spiritual, reaching toward conclusions that no one living today can foresee. The ancient prophets spoke of a day when the Lord would set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, from Assyria, and from Egypt, and from Pathros, and from Cush, and from Elam, and from Shinar, and from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. Whether these words were meant as literal predictions or as poetic expressions of hope, they have echoed down through the centuries, inspiring generations who have looked for signs of their fulfillment. The ingathering of exiles to the land of Israel in modern times has struck many as just such a sign, a return of the scattered children to the land of their ancestors that would have seemed miraculous to those who heard the prophet's words when they were first spoken. The inclusion of communities from Ethiopia and India in this ingathering has extended the reach of fulfillment beyond what earlier generations might have imagined, suggesting that the recovery of the remnant may prove to be an ongoing process rather than a single culminating event. The night is deep now, and the centuries have grown quiet. The caravans that once carried the exiles eastward into Assyria have long since crumbled into dust, and the roads they travelled have been buried beneath the accumulated layers of time. The cities where the deportees were settled, Hala and Haber and Gozan, are now barely more than names in an ancient text, their locations uncertain, their populations dispersed across the landscapes of history. Whatever communities formed in those places of exile, whatever traditions they maintained, whatever memories they preserved, have passed through transformations too numerous and too profound to trace. The threads that might connect any living population to those ancient exiles have become so fine as to be nearly invisible, woven into the vast and intricate tapestry of human descent that links all of us, ultimately, to common ancestors in the distant past. Yet the story persists, because stories are how human beings make sense of their existence, how they orient themselves in time, how they connect their brief individual lives to something larger and more enduring. The story of the lost tribes offers a framework for understanding loss and displacement, for holding on to hope in the face of catastrophe, for believing that what has been scattered will be gathered, and what has been broken will be healed. These are not minor needs, but fundamental ones, arising from the deepest sources of human experience. As long as people continue to feel displaced, to long for home, to hope for restoration, the story of the lost tribes will continue to resonate, providing a language and a narrative structure for expressing what might otherwise remain inchoate and unexpressed. Let the ancient story settle now into the darkness. Let its echoes fade into the silence between stars, and let the slow turning of the ages carry it forward into whatever futures await. The children of Israel, scattered and gathered and scattered again across the long millennia, have left their mark upon the world in ways that no exile could erase, no dispersion could efface. Their story has become humanity's story, woven into the sacred texts and the scholarly debates and the private hopes of countless millions who have found in it a mirror for their own experiences of loss and longing and return. Whether the 10 tribes still exist somewhere in identifiable form, whether their descendants will someday emerge from obscurity to claim their inheritance, whether the prophetic promises will be fulfilled in ways that vindicate the hopes of the believers or confound the expectations of all, these questions will await whatever answers the future may provide. The mystery of the lost tribes, that ancient puzzle born in the dust and fire of Assyrian conquest, has journeyed far across the millennia, touching every continent and inspiring dreams in languages that the original exiles could never have imagined. And perhaps it was always meant to remain a mystery, a question that opens onto larger questions about who we are and where we come from, and what we hope to become. A story that ends not with an answer, but with an invitation to keep wondering, keep searching, keep believing that somewhere beyond the horizon, in a place we have not yet found, the lost are waiting to be gathered home.